Hello, everyone, and welcome to the EDHRECast. I'm Matt Morgan, and I'm joined with my co-host, who he loves Tarkir because his favorite video game growing up was Double Dragon. It's Dana Roach. What's going on, buddy?
I did indeed love Double Dragon. That was a classic game.
Did you play like the full stack arcade game?
I did, yeah.
Love it.
And the NES game where like there was a cheat where you could do this elbow into an invisible a mob early on and like stack all your abilities up right away. So I remember doing that
nice.
as well.
See, I also remember Battletoads with Double Dragon. That was another favorite of mine.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Classic.
Well, Dana, we're actually here to talk about Magic the Gathering, not Double Dragon, believe it or not. But Dana, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about deck play styles and how that influences what you play, like how actually playing the deck makes a difference.
Yeah, and it often comes down to what strategy you're trying to do too. So we're trying to break everything down. We want to make this kind of an evergreen episode for everybody out there because there's a lot of players coming into the game, whether it's with all the sets that have come out with Foundations or you're a Final Fantasy player, this is your first foray into Magic the Gathering. We want to make sure that these resources are out there for you. But real quick, before we get into the episode, we have a couple quick shout outs to do first.
We are excited to be teamed up with Dragon Shield. Their sleeves come in dozens of colors and art variants, and their sleeve crafter tool at dragonshield.com is fantastic, letting you design personalized sleeves for your Magic collection. And if you were at MagicCon Chicago or the upcoming MagicCon Vegas, you might get a chance to see our personalized EDHRECast sleeves, or even get a box yourself at our live event or at dragonshield.com. If you click on the link in the description below, you get 5% off any Dragon Shield product. It makes your purchase cheaper and it supports the show. So when you take your deck into battle, wield Dragon Shield.
And if you'd like to support the show, there's lots of other ways you can do that besides clicking on the Dragon Shield link. You can subscribe in your local podcast app if you like to listen over audio. We recently did actually change RSS feeds. So if you haven't been getting episodes, make sure you resubscribe over on your podcast app or Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcast. Make sure you're getting every single episode. But if you also would like to, you can head over to patreon.com/EDHRECast. We have all sorts of patron tiers as a way to get yourself a little something in return just for supporting us over on Patreon. Whether you want to join our Discord community, there's always something going on over at Discord, whether you want to talk about the new preview seasons that are going on, all the new cards getting revealed, or just finding a game to play with folks over on webcam. There's all that and more over at patreon.com/EDHRECast, including the coveted weekly patron shoutout, where we give a very special shout out to somebody just for supporting the show. So this week, we're going to give a very special shout out to Joe Loof, who was not very aloof when he went over to patreon.com/EDHRECast to sign up. So Joe, thank you for all of your support. We definitely appreciate it.
So should we just dive right into the main show here, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see why not. Let's get into it. So Dana, this actually came up because you had an experience with a new deck of yours. So tell us about kind of how this thought process came to mind and why you wanted to tackle this as a full episode topic.
Yeah, so it's one of those things that, like, you know, if you play a deck long enough, you probably unconsciously start figuring out this deck's play patterns are different than that deck, and you just kind of find yourself doing them. In this case, I had built a new deck. It's a Jorn God of Winter deck, and it's my first attempt to kind of build a real, true Hidden Commander deck. So in this case, it's Helix Pinnacle.
Okay.
In the way Jorn works, when he attacks, you untap all the snow permanents you control. So I have all snow lands. I'm pumping that mana into Helix Pinnacle, untap the lands with Jorn, tap them again and put mana into Helix Pinnacle. I have mana doublers, things of that nature. So once I get Pinnacle out, I have ways to get men into it as fast as possible. And the first two games I played, I got myself in a position where I knew I could make a bunch of mana, so I played Helix Pinnacle, got the 100 counters on it, and didn't take the next step in thinking about whether or not I would be able to live long enough to reach my upkeep to actually win the game with Helix Pinnacle. And in both cases, I did not, in fact, live long enough to win the game. So I hadn't thought that through. Like my focus was on getting Pinnacle out, getting counters on it, but I didn't think about what I needed to do to actually take that last step and like get that win condition to fire off with me the game.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of sequencing that kind of goes into okay, how do I need to play this out? How do I need to go through it? Because sometimes it's not just as easy as like you noticed.
Right.
Okay, I can get to 100 counters. That's not a problem. I've had similar problems with all sorts of decks. So I'm excited to talk about this with you because we have a very recent and very real life example to kind of pull from when it comes to this topic.
And like I said, you probably, like most players, eventually kind of figure this out as they're playing. But if you can actually be conscious of it when you first start playing a new deck, you can probably speed up the ramp time to like just figuring out how your deck plays and what you want to do to play it most optimally, I guess, in terms of like actually winning games with it.
And Dana, you lined out 3 really good questions that you ask yourself when you're getting ready to play decks for the first time that I think is going to be super, super helpful for all the listeners out there. So what we kind of want to do with this episode is take those 3 questions and take you through the main archetypes of different decks too, that people talk about how there's aggro decks and control decks, mid-range decks and combo decks. So what does that look like and how do those 3 questions apply as we're going through and give you real life examples that we have from decks that we own?
Yeah, in the 3 questions I came up with when kind of prepping for the show that I discovered I kind of want to ask myself when I'm playing a deck to figure out how it actually plays. First is, how fast do I want to get my commander out? The second is, do I need to be able to protect my commander once it's out? And that tends to come down to how important that commander is for your game plan. And third, what tempo do I need to pursue your win condition at?
And by tempo, Dana, you mean how quickly am I trying to play? How am I sequencing things? Am I in a rush to get things done?
Right.
Or am I taking my time a little bit? Am I being a little more deliberate with what I'm doing? So, and tempo, sometimes it's hard to quantify until you actually play decks. So we'll try to give you listeners out there a lot of context to put into perspective what our thought process is and how that applies to any given deck. So real quick, Dana, let's just get into all these major archetypes, because there's 4 major ones I think most players would consider are the main players when you're building decks. There's aggressive decks or aggro decks. There's control decks that kind of do exactly that. They control the game, make sure they control the flow of what's happening. There's mid-range decks that kind of falls in between aggro and control. And then finally, there's combo decks, or what we like to say is explosive decks. Neither of us really play dedicated combo decks. So for us, at least, it feels kind of disingenuous to say they're combo decks, but explosive decks that are all about winning on one big explosive turn.
Yeah, and really, those archetypes tend to apply to any Magic format, not just Commander. Things tend to be much more blurry in Commander, to be honest, than they are in like a traditional competitive Magic format, but they still kind of exist. Like, people tend to assume most EDH decks are much more mid-rangey. And to a degree they are, I guess, but the window just shifts out, right? Like, what's an aggro deck in Modern might still be an aggro deck in EDH. It's just, instead of doing its thing on turn 3, you're doing it on turn 5 or something. Like, the window just flipped it a little bit outwards. Yeah,
like you said, the lines get pretty blurry when it comes to it, because you still have to be able to do a little bit. You need aspects of everything. Like you mentioned, an aggro deck in Modern doesn't need an engine because you only have 20 life that you have to get rid of.
Right.
So you can go all out with Goblin Guide type of cards where I'm just turning things sideways as fast as possible. Whereas in Commander, you have 120 life that you have to deal damage to, and that just takes a lot more time, takes a lot more resources. So there is a little bit of a blurred line there, but the principles still apply, and we want to take you through kind of the pros and cons of all these different strategies. So Dana, why don't you take us into aggro decks and kind of what the pros and cons are of these?
So let's start here by talking about aggro decks. And you're trying to get the game done with as fast as possible. You're trying to basically get your threats on the board and be dealing damage to people too fast for everyone else to respond. You're playing an efficient deck. It's very quick. Things are cheap to cast, and you're basically going on offense, turn 1, turn 2, like as fast as possible.
Yeah, you're probably playing creatures, you're playing a lot of threats and doing what I like to do and just making your opponents have the answers, or you're just going to overrun them. It's a lot of fun. I think a good example of this is kind of just anything that just has red in it oftentimes is probably going to be an aggro deck, or be able to go fast because red has a lot of haste. Red has a lot of just high damage creatures, so damage doublers even. I know that, Dana, you like that. Or extra combat steps. Those are some other ways that aggro decks tend to get the job done because they're just going faster and making their combat steps count.
When I think of this, I think of something like Edric's Five Master of Trest, and it's not even a red aggro deck. It's doing it in Signet colors, but the way Edric works, when a creature deals combat damage to one of your opponents, you draw a card. Well, you're just running as many small, easy to cast evasive creatures as possible. So like you've got stuff that wouldn't be playable elsewhere, like a Scrib Sprites or a Flying Men or something, 1-drop evasive creatures. But turn 1, you're playing your land, you're dropping a creature, or if you happen to hit a ramp spell, maybe 2 creatures. Turn 2, you're dropping a couple of creatures. Turn 3, you're able to swing with like those, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 creatures, but then you're drawing 3 or 4 cards, you're refilling your hand from the gas you just put on the field. Then the next turn you can put 2 or 3 or 4 more creatures out and draw that many cards. And now eventually that deck's trying to get in a position where you hit extra turn spells or you hit, overruns, Beastmaster Ascension, whatever, to turn those 1/1s into 5/5s or something. But that is kind of a distilled aggro deck in Commander. You are just going hard as fast as possible, all gas, no brakes.
Yeah, when you mentioned Edric Spymaster Chest, that's a classic aggro commander because it covers up one of the major weaknesses of aggro decks, where it's, like you said, you can just run out of steam sometimes really, really quickly because your foot is on the gas the entire time. And so with Edric Spymaster Chest, you're able to draw those cards back up and make sure you have a full stack of cards the entire time, which not every aggro deck can do that. And so sometimes you also get nullified by a single card, whether it's a board wipe, a propaganda effect. Dana, if you have 5 1-drops on the battlefield, well, propaganda makes it really, really hard to get out from underneath that.
Absolutely. Right. So like there's absolute ways to slow this kind of thing up and keep someone from getting through, because if you get to that point in the game where someone's starting to drop on their propagandas or has access to fogs, then, if they're swinging back at you with whatever giant beaters are putting into play, those 1/1s of yours aren't doing you any good. So you, again, you risk running out of gas. Well, Edric maybe solves that problem, but you also have the problem where if you get to that point in the game where everyone else is playing their big threats, you tend to just not have big threats. You're still playing small threats. And that's way less effective on turn 7 or 8 or 9 than it is on turn 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, a Raging Goblin on turn 3 or on turn 7, I should say, probably not going to get there. So yeah, absolutely. It's very easy to get outpaced. So Dana, why don't you take us through those 3 questions you posed and tell us about an aggressive deck that you have and just how those 3 questions kind of shape everything as you're building the deck and playing the deck.
Sure. So I have an Ognis, the Dragon's Lash deck that I'm playing as a kind of mono-red aggro deck. I have a bunch of creatures with haste in it. Whenever a creature with haste attacks, I make a tapped treasure token. So I just have a bunch of creatures that have haste. And the way that deck tends to work is I want to begin attacking as soon as possible. I want to get Ognis out as soon as possible so I can have a board state and be generating treasures that keep me ahead of everybody else. I'm even outracing green decks in terms of mana production, because once Ognis hits and I have those creatures in play, I'm making 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 treasures a turn. Additionally,
that adds up really quick.
Yeah. And additionally, the deck has a bunch of ways to steal my opponent's creatures and attack with them and give them haste, which generates treasures and removes blockers and lets me turn their creatures into attacking creatures. It has a way to, when I get to that mid-range point in the game and everyone else is playing big threats I don't have, I can still do things at that point in the game. But to do those things, question 1, I need to get my commander out as fast as I possibly can so I can start generating those treasures and start doing the things I want to do. So once we get past the aggro portion early on, if people are still alive in the mid-range portion of the game, I can then start taking their threats and making them into my threats. And if I don't have gas, I can't do that.
Yeah, you really did build a very commander-centric deck when you built Ognis.
Yeah.
And I know you put the restriction on yourself of this is a mono-red deck, and so you don't have access to that ramp that comes in green because you're leaning so heavily into the treasures that you're making from your commander. So sometimes if you miss a beat, maybe you don't hit your 4th land drop, kind of makes the deck sluggish a little bit.
Yeah.
But what about how important the commander is? So the second question is, do I need to be able to protect the commander or somehow just accommodate it while it's out? How does Ognis handle that question when you're playing the deck?
Yeah, I do need, particularly the first couple turns, there's definitely a point in the game where it's less relevant. But those first couple turns, I definitely need to have it protected. So it's really useful to be able to put Ognis down and have a mana free to, have some kind of protective spell available in my hand, or be able to put something like Lightning Greaves or some way to keep Ognis from dying, particularly for our first couple turns, so I can generate enough treasure to be ahead of people. And then the last question, like how fast I want to get to that win condition. Again, I want to get there as fast as possible. I want to have chipped people down with damage sufficiently those first 3, 4, 5 turns. So once they start playing their big threats, then I can use their big threats to turn that corner to end the game at that point. Then my smaller creatures that I'm chipping them down, coupled with that big beater they just dropped on turn 6, is what puts somebody away then at that point.
Yeah, so the tempo is as fast as possible. You're playing speed rock with this Ognis deck. That makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I mean, when you treat it like a mono red deck, sure, that's really all you can be doing is going as fast as possible. And so, Dana, it's interesting to me how it differs from your aggro deck to mine, which is my Jetmir Nexus of Revels deck. That's the deck I kind of want to use for today's episode as a good example, where Jetmir Nexus of Revels, that's the Naya legend where the more creatures I have, the more bonuses out there, whether it gets them up to +3/+0, it gives them vigilance, trample, double strike, all sorts of nice benefits for having a lot of creatures out there. So, but I treat the commander, actually, to answer that first question, is I only play this commander until it's a win condition. Right. I wait as long as possible, and then I play it, and I win the game right then and there. That's my tempo when it comes to playing my commander and how important it is. Now, it is very important, but I don't want Jetmir out there because it could die. I only want it out there as long as it takes to win the game, ideally. Yeah,
I mean, Jetmir in that case is kind of like dropping a True Conviction or something. Like it's a spell that you're going to put on the field. No one drops True Conviction when they have no creatures in play for the most part, because you're just asking to have it removed before it can do anything. Similar thing with Jetmir. You want to be putting Jetmir down when you're already in a position to have to just protect it for a real short window while you finish people off.
And that's a little bit due to the nature of the deck. So this is my Heir Apparent deck where I'm casting a ton of Heir Apparents every single turn. Mm-hmm. So really, to answer the second question, I only need to protect my commander long enough to survive a combat step, because I'm casting it when I have 9 or more creatures out there. I'm getting the max benefit from Jetmir, and I'm making sure that as soon as I resolve it, I might need a protection spell, but that protection spell means I win the game more often than not.
Now, how fast do you want to try to build to get to that point? Like, how fast are you pursuing your win condition there?
Well, that's a really good question. Yeah, I would say I'm trying to cast at least one Heir Apparent, if not more, every single turn. I have over 30 in the deck, and I'm constantly making sure that this is something I'm being cast. If I don't cast a Heir Apparent on turn 2, or maybe an engine card, then something went wrong, and I should not have kept that hand. That's absolutely something that I've learned as I've been playing this deck more and more. But I either take a turn off at like turn 4 or 5 to maybe cast an engine card. I think Allurin and Thrumming Stone are two of the very, very powerful cards that are worth taking a turn off for in this deck. But otherwise, it's kind of the same as your Ognis deck, where I have to be just developing the board every single turn and flooding it with all these creatures so that once I hit my 4th land, I can play Jetmir and win the game from there.
And one thing about playing that at that speed and tempo as well is you are keeping your opponents, they're reacting to you or responding to you and the constant onslaught, which makes it more difficult for them to put their shields up. Not only are you establishing that board state and getting yourself in a position to win, but you're keeping everyone else from doing the thing they want to be doing, or distracting them from doing what they want to be doing.
Yeah, keeping people on the back foot has a ton of value because they're not able to properly set up. They have to play defensively instead of being able to do things on their own terms, like playing a spell when they want to. They can't, I think a good example is you can't take turn 5 to cast some sort of a payoff spell when, you're not going to get a turn 6. You have to be playing the most offensive way possible. And that's a really, really good way. And a thing that aggro decks do a good job of is keeping people off their game because they're backpedaling the entire time.
Yeah, making people have to respond to you and you dictating the tempo of how they play is really, really powerful in Commander for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so next up, let's get into control decks. So this is kind of the antithesis, the opposite side of the spectrum as aggro decks. So control decks, like we said, They slow the game down. They do not let the board state get developed. And there's all sorts of different ways they do that. Dana, you love drawing cards. You're a control player at heart. You're wearing a blue hoodie today. It was just meant to be. We're going to talk about control decks today.
Yeah, I'm a control player. Somebody in our Discord asked me this a few weeks ago. Actually, they asked me what the secret to playing control was. I said the secret to playing control is to not let anyone else know you're playing control. Like if you're playing, 20 counter spells and like you're making it really clear you're trying to control the tempo. Number one, that's in Commander where you're trying to control 3 people versus 1 person. That's almost an impossible task. But once people are really aware you're doing that as well, they can respond. Whereas if they aren't really aware you're playing control, if you're being much more surgical about what you're responding to, it's much easier to be a control player if you're kind of doing it in a way that isn't super obvious.
Dana, I think what you said about if you're playing control right, nobody knows you're playing control. That's kind of your whole MO with Commander anyways.
Absolutely.
If people figure out what you're doing, they're probably screwed. But what control decks are really known for is just their overwhelming card advantages. Their ways to get multiple value spells out there. You're very rarely ever trading 1 for 1. You're getting 3 for 1s and 4 for 1s, if not more than that, because you're casting board wipes when you need to, and you're just making sure you're dictating the flow of the game. It's super, super important to make sure you have a really good set of answers in your deck if you're playing control, because you always want to have the right answer for the right time.
Yeah, like for me, my favorite control deck is my Isperia Supreme Judge Sphinx deck. And I always think about, the way Isperia works, whenever an opponent attacks you with a creature, you draw a card. For me, kind of the signature control play in that deck is someone will swing at me with, a handful of creatures when I have a Isperia out. I will draw, 5 or 6 cards because they're attacking me, and then cast an Aetherize or something into their board state. So in that turn, I've spent, 4 mana on an Aetherize and lost 1 card and drawn 6 cards, and that they've lost 25 mana worth of creatures at the top of their library that they now have to draw one at a time to keep them from drawing other cards. They have to replay all that stuff. The amount of that value swing from me to that one person is huge, while it also fills my hand up to deal with the other 2 people and what they're doing. Yeah,
well, and you mentioned kind of one of the inherent weaknesses with control decks, though. You're casting big mana spells. You're casting very expensive to cast, high mana value stuff out there. And sometimes, you want to cast a Isperia out there where you get to draw all those cards. Sometimes just aggro decks get to you before you're able to do that.
Right, like that particular deck, all those Sphinxes cost 5, 6, 7 mana each. To get to that point in the game, I'm trying to play ramp and play, draw spells and stuff, and like be productive until I get to that point in the game. But just because I'm being productive doesn't mean I can do much when the aggro deck is swinging at me and chumping me for 3 or 4 or 5 a turn. Hopefully, when I get to the point where I establish my board state, I can bounce back from that, maybe gain some life or have my shields up. But it's way tougher if I've been hit and I'm down to like 12 life. At that point, then you really can't afford to make a single mistake. One mistake and you're dead.
Yeah, control decks can absolutely be super, super punishing if you happen to miss a step. If you don't get enough card, velocity early in the game to get down and start digging cards out. If you don't get a powerful engine out there, like a Rhystic Study, for example, or whatever it is, you're going to miss opportunities to draw a bunch of cards because you're not getting what you need when you need it, which sometimes, like we said, control decks really need to have the right answers at the right time. And sometimes you just draw fluff too. You don't get the right cards that you need and you just miss too many beats. All
the answers in the world don't do you any good if they're in your library and not in your hand, right? Like you need to actually have them in your hand and have the ability to play them. And they don't do you any good if you're relying on getting to turn 8 to actually use all those answers. And the aggro deck has gotten you in a losing position by turn 6.
Yeah, I think that's why, for me, my control deck that I like to talk about and use in these examples is my Council of 4 deck, where all I need is like a ramp piece or 2, and then by turn 4, sometimes turn 3, if I get a Soul Ring early or whatever, getting Council of 4 out to have this 0/8 blocker out there that also happens to double as this really, really powerful card advantage engine. Absolutely super, super important. And it's not too much of a threat. I'm never actively winning through my Council of 4, having my commander on the battlefield. at least in a way that people will notice. It's not doing these big splashy things. It's getting all those incremental advantages that control decks love to have.
That's a good example of playing control without looking like you're really playing control, right? You're not like playing a Grand Arbiter deck or something where everyone knows clearly what you're doing, what the game plan is. And in a lot of cases, it's one of those weird things. Even if people know you're doing it, like you could say, I'm playing this Council of Four control deck. If it doesn't feel like you're doing it, then people don't really think of it in those terms. And that deck is a really good one for doing that. Like you can kind of play control without making, even if it's obvious, it doesn't feel obvious to people, so they don't respond to it that way.
Yeah, well, and that kind of plays into me answering the second question that we have is, how much do we need to defend our commander, protect it? I don't really ever feel the need to put a bunch of resources into defending Council of Four because it doesn't feel like I'm controlling the game through Council of Four and what it's doing. Oftentimes, I can just have Council 4 sit there and it never gets removed. It never gets targeted. If there's a board wipe, then it'll die. But very rarely am I having to cast Council 4 more than twice a game.
Yeah, I mean, I've won plenty of games with that Isperia deck where I just haven't cast Isperia. I've had enough Sphinxes in hand. I've had things happening. It's never been a situation where I needed to cast it, so I didn't. Whereas that Ognis deck or an EDHRECast deck, there's no situation where you're not casting those commanders. The way those decks work, you need to have them out, and that's not true of your Council of Four deck. It's not true of my Isperia deck.
Yeah, I feel like there's something. I feel like we could call it the Drannith Magistrate test, where does your deck fold to having Drannith Magistrate on the battlefield? And definitely these control decks. If you're building a control deck that folds to a Drannith Magistrate, you probably need to play more answers in this because that's the whole point of playing control decks. You're not reliant on one specific thing. You're reliant on more general answers out there in the game.
Yeah, you can kind of pick and choose in multiple paths to victory. And, there's a resiliency to that too. Those aggro decks tend to have a pretty clear and straightforward path. When you're playing a control deck, there's a lot of different paths you can take, and there's a lot more room for improvisation while the game is going on than there is in aggro for the most part.
Yeah, knowing when to act and when to kind of be passive with control decks is a super, super important skill. And that kind of plays into finally the third question here is, what's the tempo like for control decks? And Dana, I'm sure both of our answers is going to be, you put slow in the notes. I'm going to say deliberate. I'm going to say you want to make sure you're being very intentional about everything, but also you never want to miss a land drop when you're playing a control deck. No matter what colors it is, you want to be hitting your land drops. You're probably not playing enough lands if you're playing control deck. You need at least 37, 38 lands to start.
Yes, you need to always have resources. I said improvisation before, but that's true. You are picking your moment in a way that you maybe don't with an aggro deck for sure. You are waiting till that everyone's underbelly is exposed when they've thrown things at you and you've bounced those attacks off and they've kind of punched themselves out, so to speak. And you are kind of the last man standing with more resources than everybody else, and then you can make your move. If you just have to be able to do that dance a little bit and pick that perfect time to strike.
Yeah, absolutely. My Council 4 deck absolutely has to know when to pivot, but when it does, it's able to do that pretty well because I get to have Council 4 out there accumulating me resources, making a whole bunch of knights ideally, but then I can just turn a Herald of Hoofbeats or something like Raise the Palisade. More often than not, that's going to win the game the same way that an Overrun would win for any green deck.
Yeah. But you get to find that perfect time to do it.
Yeah, or I create the time.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
All right, Dana, so we got through two categories. We got through aggro, got through control. Let's get to the other two categories, but first we've got to take a quick break for Challenge of Stats. There's all sorts of stats out there on EDHREC, and we don't always agree with them, so we're going to take a quick break to thank our sponsors and to Challenge of Stats. This year, like every other year and every other couple, my partner and I have been trying to get some healthier habits into place. I like to work out, she likes to eat salads, but neither of us can do both. It's just impossible. But one thing we found that we both can do is making AG1 an easy part of our daily routine. One scoop is all it takes, whether you're mixing it into a smoothie like she does, or you're like me, where I'm just taking it head on with water. AG1 is out there filling the gaps where my regular diet falls short. And by diet, I mean lots of things with the word rodeo in the name. I never said it was a good diet. But again, AG1 helps with all of that. I've been seeing improvements myself with less bloated feelings during the day and just have more energy. I suppose I can kind of thank the whole spectrum of ingredients, whether it's the pre and probiotics, or these things they call vitamins and minerals. That sounds too good to be true, but apparently, Magic players can't just live off of fast food and energy drinks. Now we can power through the day with AG1 to get some energy the natural way and with B vitamins so we don't crash like with other drinks. So if you want to check out their 75 vitamins and minerals sourced from some of the highest quality ingredients for yourself, now is the best time to do it. You can head to drinkag1.com/EDHRECast or scan the QR code on your screen to get started today. Every new customer using our link supports the show and will get a welcome kit with $76 worth of gifts along with $20 off their first order. That's almost $100 of value just for going to drinkag1.com/EDHRECast. Scan the QR code today or head to drinkag1.com/EDHRECast today.
This past month has been one of the busiest of my life, which of course has meant I haven't had a lot of time. But that doesn't mean I have to neglect my nutrition, and that's why we're so happy for this episode's sponsor, Huel, who has an amazing offer. New customers visit huel.com/EDHREC today and use our code EDHREC to get 15% off your first order plus a free gift. Huel is a nutritionally complete food, a meal in a bottle that comes in a variety of flavors, and as you can probably guess, my favorite flavor is iced coffee. One bottle contains 35 grams of protein, 27 vitamins and minerals. Huel has essential fats, carbs, fiber, and phytonutrients, and it's low in sugar. Lately, I've been constantly hopping from meeting to meeting to meeting, so either a Huel shake or Huel Black Edition, ready to drink, have been just clutch to help keep me full and focused. Huel is a perfectly balanced meal designed by nutrition experts, and it takes the guesswork out of healthy eating. It's high in protein, which helps me hit my macros. It has vitamin C, which I know supports my immune system, and it's also just stupidly convenient. The perfect pairing for a busy day. Take hold of your nutrition and give Huel a try. Once again, new customers visit huel.com/EDHREC today and use our code EDHREC to get 15% off your first order plus a free gift.
And Challenge of Stats is brought to you by Cardsphere, the best way to turn your unplayed cards into played cards. I was just talking about my new Jorn God of Winter deck, and probably half the cards I got for it came from Cardsphere. You can send out cards you don't need for credit towards cards you want, or simply deposit credit directly into your account, and other users will send you the cards you want straight to your mailbox. Go to cardsphere.com to check out our favorite way to build up decks.
Well, let me get us started real quick with a listener-submitted challenge that comes to us from the user BattleDroid, who sent us an email, which all of you can do over at edhrecast@gmail.com. So BattleDroid said, I have a challenge for Pyr Imaginative Rascal and Toothy Imaginative Friend. So 28% of these decks are currently running Mystic Remora, and with Pyr's ability to put additional counters, it's going to make cumulative upkeep cost way more right away. So Mystic Remora is that super powerful engine. It's just a blue mana, has cumulative upkeep of 1 mana, but then it also says whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4 generic mana. And so with Pyr and Toothy out there, this gets really expensive really quick because Pyr has the ability of whenever one or more counters would be put on a permanent your team controls, that many +1 of each of those kinds of counters are put on that permanent instead. Now, important to point out there, that's not a may. That is a mandatory thing, which includes cumulative upkeep, because the way that it works, you put a time counter on it and then you pay the mana for however many cumulative upkeep counters are on there. BattleDroid then goes on to say the first turn after it comes down, you'll be at 2 and then 4 the next turn, and there are more than enough ways to draw cards in Simic colors that I don't think cumulative upkeep costs are going to be worth it for any potential card draw. And BattleDroid, you are right. I always love getting overplayed challenges when you listeners send us emails, and especially for one that, if you ask the typical player, is Mystic Remora overplayed? They're never going to say yes. They're going to disagree with you and say, you should play Mystic Remora because it's such a powerful card draw engine. But you're absolutely correct. In this specific instance, with the synergy that you have with the commander, which I'm assuming you're going to have in play more often than not, you don't want this synergy laying around there. So if you have an alternative to find a powerful engine for your Pyr and Toothy decks, you absolutely want to consider it, because Mystic Remora just isn't it for this deck.
I'm going to start this off with a card that is not my challenge, but I'm going to mention it because this is the second time it's happened where I've ran into somebody playing a Vashta Narada deck. That is a creature from the Doctor Who set that based on that name you would think would be legendary, and it is in fact not a legendary creature. 2 different times I've run into somebody who actually built that deck, and not as a Rule 0 deck, they just weren't aware it wasn't a legend because it looks like it is. So my bonus challenge is, if you're going to build a Vashta Narada deck, do it as a Rule 0 deck, or be aware it's actually not a legend because it looks like it is.
Okay, so Dana, did that actually happen though? I have to know.
It's happened twice, and it happened last night was the second time I ran into it, where the person didn't know.
Oh, no.
And it's a perfectly reasonable commander to do as a Rule 0, so it wasn't a big deal. But yeah, it's people genuinely have missed 2 different times that I've ran into where they missed that it was not a legend.
There's so many random cards out there that aren't legendary that feel like they should, or cards that shouldn't be legendary, but they are. There's all sorts of weird corner cases out there that it's always hard to catch. But yeah, absolutely great reminder that naming a card still doesn't make it legendary. Yes. But with that, let's get back into the main topic of the show. So we have 2 more categories to go over here. We got mid-range and we got combo decks out there. So Dana, with mid-range decks, I feel like this, like we said at the top of the show, a lot of decks probably happen to fall into this category by the nature of commander. So why don't you take us through mid-range decks with a bird's eye view?
When I think about a mid-range deck, I think of the first commander decks I built when I first got into this format, where my plan was to just play a bunch of stuff, and hopefully at some point in the game I'll have more stuff than my opponent and I can kill them by having a 5/5 ult while they're at 4 life or something. And that's kind of, in a lot of cases, how mid-range decks work. You are at some point going to be too much of a threat for a aggro deck to deal with, but you're also probably going to have too much variable things going on for a control deck to be able to deal with too, hopefully. There's no way to surgically shut you down as easily as there is the aggro deck, so you're just kind of jack of all trades in a lot of ways.
Yeah, battle cruiser is the word that comes to mind.
Yep.
Whenever people say commander is just battle cruiser decks, they're probably talking about a bunch of mid-range decks playing against each other that they're always doing something at all stages of the game, whether they're ramping early, they're casting into payoffs late game, and sometimes they're just able to just accrue so many resources, get just value out of every single thing that they do, which is one of the nice things about mid-range decks that I would wager so many players love playing mid-range decks because, again, they just get value out of everything they do.
You're just always doing something in that kind of deck. And it lends itself to playing a lot of like fun cards that particularly like a newer player likes. You know, every creature in your deck a lot of times is a cool version of a siege rhino, right? Where it's just doing things when it comes into play and when it leaves play and when it attacks, and like you just are always busy with things happening all the time, generating value.
Yeah, and you're jack of all trades, like you said, Dana, but you're master of none. You're not really excelling at anything either. You're not going as fast as the aggro decks do because people are turning sideways while you're tapping a Land War Elves for mana or whatever that looks like. But then you can't board wipe like a control deck does because you still need to set up a little bit. So you kind of fall in that weird in-between space where sometimes there's no congruent identity for all mid-range decks because everything has to be handled a little bit differently. So you do have to pay a little bit more attention, I would say, to the average mid-range deck. Maybe you're playing a lot more on synergy, anything like that too. But you're probably reliant on synergies and engine cards more than the other 2 types of decks that we've talked about so far.
Yeah, and I think an example of this, when you ask that first question, how fast do you want your commander out? I usually, in my mid-rangey decks, want my commander out pretty quickly because it's generating me value. But that's why I want it out, though. I don't want it out because I need it as a piece of my deck like you would with my Ognis deck or Edric from Master of Trest. I want it out because it's a useful piece to have in play, which then means the second question is, do I need to protect it? Not really. It's useful to have out, and I don't want it gone. But if someone's removing that mid-range commander, that's usually kind of a bad choice. It's useful, but there's almost always something scarier in play. Yeah,
there's always something scarier is a good way to describe mid-range decks because you can get rid of their 4-drop that might have a high impact on the game, but that means they're going to play a 5-drop later. And then they're probably going to play a 6-drop because they either have an engine. Like I would say the Great Henge is kind of the penultimate mid-range card where it does a little bit of everything. It's not super good, but just everything just well enough that makes it an amazing card. It's super, super powerful. And that's probably why stuff like Ukkima and Cazur is my mid-range deck of choice, where it doesn't do anything excellent, but it does things just well enough that it can power through and just catch up. And I've made a lot of changes to this deck too. It's a brackets 2 deck, but it was playing a few game changers. So when the new bracket system came out, I did a lot of tinkering with this deck because I wanted to not be in that higher power level, even though it is capable, but it's just, I wanted it to play down a little bit more. So I had to change some cards out. So Ukkima actually is a commander, because I do have 2 commanders. Ukkima is just a secondary card to the game plan. The rest of it is just putting +1/+1 counters onto Cazur, which takes a little bit of time, but I also need Cazur out as soon as possible because you can't really put any counters on something that isn't on the battlefield.
I always think of, I think it was Jerry Seinfeld had an old comedy bit about the reason men are always dressed identically at weddings is in case something happened to the groom, the next guy can just step up into his place. And so you just have a line of guys that can replace one another. And that's kind of how a lot of times these mid-range decks feel with the commander. It's useful and it's doing something, but like if it gets knocked out, the next one just steps up into place and takes that slot.
That's a really, really good way to put it. Yeah. And you always have to find a little bit of a balance. At least in my Ukkima and Cazur deck, you really do need to find that balance because, Cazur is a huge piece of the game plan, and I have to protect it. But also, if Cazur gets destroyed, Forgotten Ancient still is going to get 15 counters on it per turn. And there's all sorts of, there's a lot of redundancy, which is a really nice thing for a lot of mid-range decks. And finally, just what's the tempo like in Ukkima and Cazur? Absolutely. I need to find that one accelerator, that one massive payoff cards, and then just churn through the enablers, find all the ways. I need one branching evolution and then a bunch of ways to put counters onto all my creatures. I don't need a branching evolution plus a Corpse Jack Menace plus another doubler. I only need one of those cards. And that is kind of a fail point for this deck specifically, but I would wager for a lot of mid-range decks is you might find these engine cards because they are so powerful. You always want one of them, but maybe you don't always want 2 of them. So you have to find a real weird balance in the deck of how many do I need so I reliably have one every game, but I don't have more than I need, because then you're just watering down what you're actually doing on the battlefield.
That's always a tricky thing to balance out in general, is redundancy without having so many things that it's not useful and you're running pieces that are just don't do anything because something else is doing the same effect. I was thinking of things that give you like double strike, for example. Double strike's useful and you want multiple things that maybe give your creature double strike, but if you have 2 of those things out, it doesn't do any good.
Yeah, the redundancy is good, but you don't always want that happening. I think a really good conversation actually was on the command zone. They talked about the new deck building templates and the payoffs versus the enablers and the ratio you want to have of those. That's a really, really good conversation. Definitely check out Rachel's conversation over there, because if you want more in depth onto how you need to figure out these ratios and maybe fit it into a template, that's kind of a must-watch video over there.
Yeah, they do a great job breaking it down, the different ways that you can brew a deck. And then they also do a show where they talk about the times you should ignore those things and like the situations where they don't apply. Because that's how these things work. You have to kind of find your own path. The templates are a nice way to start, but then you have to kind of go from there and learn what works for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And so our last category, Dana, we've got these combo decks. We're going to call them explosive decks because neither of us build dedicated combo decks. But if you're playing CEDH, you're probably playing a dedicated combo deck or something in these other categories too. So we want to make sure we give a shout to the combo, to the explosive decks out there. And
there's plenty of like explosive decks that feel like a combo deck, even if they're not. Joey's Sir Conrad deck, for example. Sir Conrad's out and he's not looping some kind of an infinite thing, but he'll oftentimes get to a point where there's just a bunch of things that will go in and out of the graveyard for whatever reason that's going to generate lethal damage on everyone simultaneously.
Yeah, I think a good way to describe explosive decks is once you have it set up, you only need that one big turn, that one explosive spell to really push you over the edge, where control decks, maybe once they turn the corner, they're killing you over multiple turns. These decks are killing you right away. They're killing you in one big explosive turn.
Yeah, I have a Jaheira, Friend of the Forest, Agent of the Iron Throne deck. Jaheira lets me tap tokens to generate a mana, and Agent of the Iron Throne, whenever a creature is put in the graveyard, deals a damage, so kind of an Aristocrat's effect. That's my Eldrazi Spawns and Scions deck. The way that kind of works is I will get Agent of the Iron Throne out and oftentimes a second version of that kind of effect. And then all of those Spawns and Scions that I can sacrifice at will, well, they also tap for mana and they sacrifice for mana. So while it may look like my board state isn't that imposing, I can do things that all of a sudden that turn between sacrificing those tokens, all the mana I make from them giving me something else that I can make more tokens with that I sacrifice. It's very easy to all of a sudden do 25 damage to every single person at the table sometimes when I get to the right point in the game. Out of nowhere.
I've definitely seen that happen too. And you're right. The double dipping of tapping for mana plus sacking for mana in that deck makes it so stinking scary. So I see why that can lead to just some massively explosive turns. The same deck that jumps out to me is my Ovika Enigma Goliath deck, which is this big splashy Eldrazi where whenever I'm casting non-creature spells, I'm making a bunch of goblins that have haste. And this deck is all about kind of like what you were talking about, where once you have a chance to set up and establish what the deck is trying to do, you only need one turn to really just overrun the table. And that's kind of the same thing here. And to answer the first question of when do I want Ovika out there, I don't want Ovika out until right before I have that big explosive turn, because 7 mana is a lot, especially in Izzet colors, and having that removed once or heaven forbid twice, that's going to shut down a huge majority of my game plan, which is why, to answer the second question, I have to protect Ovika. I have to have some sort of way of protecting it as soon as it comes down, and then through that next turn cycle, because I want to untap and then have that turn where I kill the entire table. That's just how the play pattern for Ovika works. And so the tempo is, again, kind of like a control deck, very deliberate, using my life as a resource. That's one thing, Dana, you do all the time in your decks is, I'm going to bide my time. 3 damage early, that doesn't really matter because I'm still going to get to that turn where I turn the corner and slam the door shut.
Yeah, I mean, whether you're at 40 life or 2 life at the end of the game, as long as everyone else is at 0, it doesn't matter.
A win's a win, yeah, no matter what your life total is.
Yeah, and similarly to that Jaheira deck, like I'm not racing Jaheira out. I want to not put her into play until I'm at a point in the game where I can really utilize her ability. Now, I don't maybe need to protect her as much as you do in your Ovika deck, but I still want to make sure she is out when she's usable and I'm able to do something big and splashy. Because like you said, what I don't want to have happen is have her come out too soon, have her get removed. Well, then I got to take a turn to, cast her for 5 or 7 or something that really limits my ability to take that big turn and do all the things I want to do explosively out of nowhere.
Yeah, with these combo decks, with these explosive decks, the timing matters more than anything. You want to make sure you're getting things done right, because obviously with these decks, you can win out of nowhere. That's one of the huge pros and reasons to play combo decks is you can truly win just by being super unassuming and then having this massive turn. You're able to set up and kind of get your board moving, get stuff established while everybody else is beating themselves up. And then you're able to exploit it when your opponents happen to tap out at the wrong moment.
And this is, you really see this in CEDH where someone is going for whatever kind of combo win they have. And then you see the stack wind up getting, 8 spells deep or something as everyone's trying to respond. And the person going for the win is trying to keep them from responding. And you just get a huge stack of things that then have to unfold. But that happens in casual too with combos and explosive decks. People are going to try to stop you from doing the thing you're doing. And while that stack might not go 8 deep, I've seen plenty of stacks go 4 or 5 deep when you're trying to get that explosive win or that combo win and everyone's trying to respond to it. People still have ways to deal with that, and you have to be ready to protect that win because oftentimes you're throwing all your resources into that, right? It's a one and done, and if you don't pull it off there, you probably don't get a second chance.
Yeah, Glass Cannon is a good way to describe some of these decks and how they function, where you might be able to win out of nowhere, but if they get rid of you, if they stifle you at the right moment, sometimes you can't recover from that because you put so many resources into that one specific turn. Like, Dana, if I set up with my Ovika deck and I had a Surge to Victory and I had 15 goblins and they're all 8/8s or whatever, well, that doesn't matter if you have an Aether Spouts. And all of a sudden, all those goblins are back in my hand, and I just have to retry everything all over again. Sometimes combo decks just can't recover from the right piece of interaction at the right time, and that is a huge downside on why I think so many on the social aspect of Commander, so many players don't build these combo decks because they can be pretty fragile.
Yeah. And that can feel real bad if you've thrown all your eggs in that one basket and it does fizzle for whatever reason because someone has a response or something.
Yeah, it is discouraging, but it also requires a lot of timing. But that timing, learning these types of decks can be incredibly rewarding, super satisfying to finally get it to pull off too. I know I had a Mael the Anima deck that had Mael's Aria in it, and finally getting that to work. That wasn't so much a combo, but it was a mid-range win. But getting something like that is super, super satisfying. So I understand the appeal of these, even though I know it's not necessarily the most popular type of archetype in more social circles.
The last way this is kind of relevant here, and it isn't even about your deck and your deck's play style, it's useful to ask these questions of yourself when you're looking at your opponent's deck, particularly when you're trying to figure out how you want to respond to them. You can look at their commander oftentimes and get a feel for what this deck is going to look like. When you look across the table and see Joey's busted out Sir Conrad, like, okay, this is at some point going to be something explosive, and Sir Conrad is a very important part of that. So you know right away his commander is going to come out probably not till he's ready. It's important for him to protect that commander, and he's going to wait till he has all those pieces assembled to go for his win, usually pretty quickly in kind of one fell swoop. If you ask those questions mentally and answer them about your opponents, it makes it much easier for you to figure out how to interact with them and deal with them, their deck, and have a plan to keep them from winning while you go for your win.
And sometimes too, you can suss out a lot of these details by having just a good rule zero conversation. You can ask people questions. Oh, like, what are you looking to do? And they, say I pull out a deck and, oh, this is your Tom Bombadil deck. What does it do? Well, you can kind of gauge by the commander. Oh, it's Tom Bombadil, it's going to be doing a lot of sagas. It's probably going to give you a lot of value. So it's probably a fairly straightforward mid-range deck that isn't really, it's not going to combo anybody out unless they're doing a lot of manipulation, going through a lot of hoops. So you can kind of suss out either by the commander, some hints that they drop throughout the conversation too of, okay, these are types of things and here's how I can categorize that player for this game.
This is something too that I've kind of noticed. I need to be more conscientious of making myself actively do than I once did. So if you think back to 10 years ago or so when you're playing Commander, the amount of commanders you actually saw for the most part was pretty limited. Like, oh, this person's playing a Krenko deck. Well, I know what that Krenko deck's doing because that person last game had a Krenko deck, and the person 2 pods ago had a Krenko deck. Or, I know what this Rafik deck is doing because I've seen 3 Rafik decks tonight. When we get 6 or 8 sets a year that oftentimes have 20 or 30 or 40 legends in them, it's not nearly as easy for you to just have a mental inventory of what these decks are going to do. You often, and then therefore know how to respond. You often have to actively make it a point to look and go, oh, I've never seen this thing before, because there's so many options nowadays. Read the card and then try to figure out, okay, how do I think this deck is going to play out? If you actually spend that few seconds just thinking that through and looking at that commander and taking a mental inventory, that can make your responses much easier and much more natural, and that will help you out when you play as well.
Yeah, just being active listener and just reading cards. Don't be afraid to tell people too. Hey,
absolutely.
Hey, can I read your commander real quick? I have no idea what this does. I have to do that so often. Like when we were in Chicago, actually, for MagicCon, I probably had to ask a person every game, if not 2. Yeah. Okay, what does this commander do? Because there's so many commanders out there. It's hard to remember just what cards do in your own deck, much less what people are doing. And so, don't be afraid to just ask questions in that pregame conversation. And generally, people will be friendly. People will be willing to kind of, okay, here's my commander. Yeah, please read it. But don't be afraid to. I think that's something that a lot of folks just on the social piece, people get afraid to ask questions because it might come across challenging or anything like that. It's never been an issue in games that I've played in, so hopefully it isn't for you all either.
And one of the things we've talked about a lot here is we've used the term this will help you win or get to your win condition or whatever. It's not just necessarily about winning. It's just about having a better experience. And if you know what's coming and you're prepared for it, I mean, win or lose, it's just a better experience for you if you are prepared for what's happening and you are you have thought about it and you kind of have mentally got yourself in a place to deal with it and interact with that deck appropriately.
Absolutely.
It's just a better time.
Yeah, mentally preparing, just, knowing what I'm in store for with this game. Even if you lose the game, you at least were mentally prepared to face something where I feel like maybe getting surprised by a certain strategy I wasn't expecting to go in, and then I'm playing against 3 combo decks. At least mentally going in there, knowing ahead of time is going to ease my thought process, and just my expectations have been set. That's huge. I love that point, Dana.
Yeah. It just makes for a better game for everybody else. In frankly, oftentimes it makes a better game for your opponents too. Like people,
yeah, it does.
You know, there are pub stompers out there, but for the most part, folks want a good game. And if you,
nobody wants to get mismatched.
Yeah. If you paying attention a little bit helps you make for a better game, everyone wins.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's going to wrap us up here. This was a great conversation. I'm glad we got a chance to do this, Dana, and talk through all these categories and how we do this in our own game. So with that, where can everybody find you on social media real quick, and we'll get out of here?
You can find me online at Dana Roach. I write articles for EDHREC and Commander's Herald, and you can find all of us together at patreon.com/EDHRECast.
And I'm Matt Morgan. You can find me on pretty much any social media platform at Mathimus55. That's MATHIMUS55. And don't forget, we are proud to join forces with Dragon Shield for some of the best accessories out there to protect our cards. You should definitely trust them to protect your cards as well. And if you'd like to find Joe, you can find him at Joseph M. Schultz on pretty much every social media platform as well. And with that, I think we're going to get out of here. So Dana, thanks again for tuning in and recording with us. Listeners, let us know what categories you put a lot of your decks into. Are there certain strategies you have that you love to play, or some that maybe are a little bit of a struggle? And how do you answer these questions for yourself? Let us know in the comments for sure. But until next week then, folks, make sure to EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.